The morning the bells stopped ringing was the morning everything changed. For 372 years, without exception or pause, the sound had echoed across the valley at dawn. Through wars and famines, through floods that swallowed entire harvests and winters so bitter that livestock froze in their stalls, through births and deaths and all the ordinary suffering that fills a human life, the bells had rung. They marked time itself in this place. They called people to prayer and to work, to celebration and to mourning. They were as constant as the mountains that surrounded the village, as reliable as the river that ran through it, as essential to the rhythm of existence as breath itself. Then, one autumn morning in 1847, they fell silent. The silence was deafening. If you're captivated by stories of communities transformed by extraordinary circumstances, of the hidden resilience in ordinary people facing impossible choices, please subscribe to this channel. Every single day, we bring you a new story of history's most compelling moments. Comment, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? Tales of villages and towns, of people who lived through times that tested everything they believed in. Stories that remind us how fragile civilization truly is and how strong the human spirit can become when pushed to its absolute limits. To understand what the silence meant, you must first understand what the bells had meant. In the village of Kressendorf, and we'll call it that for the real name has been swallowed by time, the bells were not merely a sound, they were a language. They were the voice of order itself. The church stood at the exact center of the village, as was the custom of the time. Built in 1475, it had been constructed stone by stone by the hands of men whose names no one remembered anymore. The tower rose 90 feet into the air, and at its heart hung 3 bells. The largest, named Martin after the patron, weighed 4 tons. It was cast from bronze and inscribed with Latin words that few in the village could read. I summon the living, I mourn the dead, I call the faithful to prayer. The second bell, named Catherine, was smaller and sweeter toned. The third, smallest of all and named for the village itself, had a voice like a child's laugh. Every morning at 5 o'clock, old Hermann Steiger would climb the 147 steps to the bell tower. This was not a job that changed hands often. Hermann had been the bell ringer for 43 years. His father had been the bell ringer before him for 51 years. Before that, his grandfather for 48 years. The role passed through families like land or cattle, and Hermann wore it like a cloak that fit perfectly to his shoulders. His job was simple in description, but essential in practice. He would grasp the ropes thick as a man's wrist and worn smooth by decades of hands, and begin to ring, not all 3 bells at once. That was reserved for emergencies or celebrations. The morning summons was performed with all 3, yes, but in a specific sequence that everyone in the village could recognize without thinking. First Martin, the deep boom that rattled windows 3 streets away. Then Catherine with her melodious tone. Then the small bell, Kressendorf, with its bright ring like a voice calling, "Wake up, wake up, wake up." This sequence lasted for 3 minutes. It took exactly 3 minutes for the sound to wake the village, for fathers to roll from their beds, and mothers to begin the day's work, for children to understand that sleep time had ended, and the world was beginning again. Then at 6 o'clock Hermann would ring again. Just Catherine this time, 6 measured peals. This meant go to work. The fields needed tending, the bakery needed to open, the smith needed to heat his forge, the school needed to gather its students. At noon, all 3 bells would ring together in a joyous cascade. This was the signal for the midday meal, for the brief pause in labor that kept human beings connected to the rhythms of their own bodies. At 6 in the evening came the work's end, signaled by Martin alone, a deep and authoritative tone that said, "Stop now, rest now. The day has been enough." And finally, at 9 o'clock at night, all 3 bells would ring in a slower, more solemn pattern, a pattern that said, "Sleep now. Tomorrow will come. Tomorrow you will rise again." But there were other rings too, rings that disrupted the pattern and carried special meanings. A rapid, urgent tolling meant fire. Everyone who heard it knew to grab buckets and run to the square. 3 slow peals meant a death. The village would listen and count, because the number of peals would tell them the age of the deceased. A child, 5 peals. An adult, 3. An elder, 7 or more, depending on how long they had lived. Then there were the bells for feast days, for the holy days of the church calendar. Christmas was marked by continuous ringing for an hour, a cascade of sound so joyous it seemed to lift the very roofs of houses. Easter brought 3 hours of bells, their sound the ultimate expression of resurrection and renewal. But ordinary days, the work days that made up the vast majority of existence, were marked by the regular schedule. This was the heartbeat of the community. This was the invisible infrastructure that held everything together. In a time before clocks were common in working villages, before every person carried a mechanism that told them the time, before the tyranny of exactness that would one day come to dominate human civilization, the bells were the clock. They were the only clock most people ever needed, and they were never wrong. Hermann Steiger knew this with a bone-deep certainty. He was a man of 68 years old, and his entire life had been lived in relationship to these bells. He had rung them through his youth with energy in his middle years, with steady competence, and in his elder years with the kind of ritual precision that comes from doing something so many times that your body could do it without your mind is involvement. He took pride in this. There had been nights when he could not sleep when pain in his joints or anxiety about the world kept him awake, and he would simply lie in his bed knowing that in the morning he would rise and climb those steps and ring the bells. The knowledge was a comfort. It meant that something in his life was permanent, reliable, essential. A man could live his entire existence knowing that, whatever else happened in the chaotic and difficult world, he had this one sacred duty, and he would fulfill it. His wife had died 12 years earlier. His children had moved to larger cities and made their lives there. But Hermann remained, and the bells remained with him. The trouble, though no one called it that at first, began in the spring of 1846 with the arrival of Father Johann. The previous priest, Father Albrecht, had served the parish for 60 years. He was 91 when he died, and his death was not sudden. Rather, it was a long diminishment, a slow letting go. In his final years, he could barely mount the steps to the altar. He would stand before the congregation and sometimes forget what words he was saying. He would begin a prayer and drift into silence, lost in whatever landscape his mind had traveled to. The bishop in distant Zurich sent Father Johann to replace him. Father Johann was a young man of 32, educated in the modern seminaries, filled with ideas about reform and improvement. He came from a wealthy family in the city. He had studied not just theology, but philosophy, history, and mathematics. He had read books about the Enlightenment, about science, about the need for the church to modernize itself or be left behind by history's forward march. He was well-intentioned. History is filled with young men of good intentions, and history is also filled with the suffering they sometimes cause. Father Johann arrived on a Tuesday in May, dressed in traveling clothes that were newer and finer than anything most of the village had ever seen. He was installed as the new priest in a simple ceremony. He gave his first sermon that Sunday, and it was impressive. He spoke with eloquence about the role of the church in the modern world, about the importance of education, about the need for progress and improvement. He also noticed everything. He noticed that only about 40% of the village attended church on Sundays. He noticed that the Bible was chained to the lectern and that most people could not read anyway. He noticed that many of the customs practiced by the villagers were not technically sanctioned by church doctrine. He noticed that the bells rang according to a schedule no one had explicitly justified through Scripture. After his first month, he began to make small changes. The first was to the Sunday service itself. He began using a new translation of the Bible, one that was more modern and therefore more difficult for the villagers to follow, because they had grown accustomed to the old Latin rhythms and the accents of the previous priest. He introduced new hymns. He began preaching sermons that were less about the comfort of faith and more about the discipline of morality. None of this was wrong exactly. He was, by any reasonable measure, trying to improve the spiritual life of his flock. But improvement and disruption are sometimes indistinguishable from the perspective of those experiencing them. The second month brought greater changes. Father Johann announced that he wanted to institute a new practice. Every morning before the regular work bells, there would be an optional religious service. A dawn devotion, he called it. This meant that the bells could not ring at their usual 5 o'clock time. Instead, They would ring at 6:30 after the devotion had concluded. This was a disruption to the schedule. It was not a catastrophic disruption. Half an hour is a small amount of time in the grand measure of things, but in a village where everything ran on the bells, where farmers knew to be in their fields by a certain point in the morning, where the baker knew when to have bread ready, half an hour was significant. The village adapted, as villages do. People are remarkably flexible when they must be, remarkably capable of adjusting their lives to accommodate new circumstances. The morning shift started half an hour later. The sun would be higher in the sky before work began. In summer, this meant more daylight for evening labor. In winter, it meant the workday ended in deeper darkness. But people adapted. What they did not adapt to, what began to create the first real tension, was what happened next. 3 months into his tenure, Father Johann began to have doubts about the bells themselves. It started, he would later explain, as a theological question. Were the bells truly necessary for prayer and devotion? Or were they, in fact, distractions? Were they not, in some sense, a form of idolatry, the worship of a sound rather than the worship of God? He posed this question during a pastoral council meeting held in the sacristy of the church with the village's leading citizens. Jakob Metzler, the mayor, Franz Kaufmann, the wealthiest merchant, Hans Bachmann, the master of the craft guild, and old Hermann Steiger, representing the long tradition of the bells. "I wonder," Father Johann said, his voice thoughtful and measured, "whether the bells serve the spiritual needs of this community, or whether they have simply become a habit. A necessary habit, perhaps, but a habit nonetheless." Jakob Metzler, who was 65 years old and had served as mayor for 12 years, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The bells have always been important, Father. They structure our days, they bring us together. But do they bring you closer to God?" Father Johann asked, "or do they simply keep you organized? Surely God does not require bells to reach his people." This was a sophisticated argument, and it was also, in its way, unanswerable. Of course, God did not require bells. God was infinite and beyond such material things, but humans required some external structure, some way to mark the passages of time and the sacred occasions of their lives. The bells provided this. They were not God, but they were how humans interacted with the presence of God in their community. Hermann spoke up quietly. His voice was rough from years of shouting into the wind during storms, from calling to people across distances. "The bells are the community," he said. "When they ring, every person hears them. We are all together in that sound. We are all reminded that we belong to something larger than ourselves." Father Johann nodded respectfully. "I understand, and yet I wonder whether we might achieve the same sense of community through other means, through conscious devotion, through gathering together in the church for spiritual purposes, rather than simply hearing a sound that summons us like cattle to be herded." This phrase, "like cattle," was the first truly inflammatory thing he had said. It carried a judgment, an implication that the bells were something base, something beneath the dignity of spiritual beings. Still, nothing was decided that night. Father Johann said he simply wanted to raise the question, to invite thought and discussion. He suggested that they might consider conducting a trial, 1 week with the bells following a modified schedule, perhaps just a single bell each morning, a more humble summons, perhaps fewer rings throughout the day. The council agreed to think about it. They would discuss it at the next meeting, in 1 month's time. That month was when the true division began to appear. The village started to split into factions, though no one explicitly called them that. There were those who believed Father Johann was right, that progress meant questioning even the things that seemed most fixed and permanent. Mostly, these were younger people, those who had traveled beyond the village, those who saw in Father Johann an educator and a potential source of advancement. And there were those who believed that some things should not be questioned, that the bells were part of the fabric of the community, and that to question them was to question the community itself. These were mostly older people, people who had lived their entire lives in relationship to the bells' rhythm, people who understood them not as an arbitrary system, but as the natural order of things. The argument became personal quickly, as arguments do in small communities where everyone knows everyone else. Franz Kaufmann, the wealthy merchant, sided with Father Johann. He saw in the priest's modernizing impulses something that aligned with his own commercial interests. More efficient schedules meant more productive days, meant more wealth. He spoke to anyone who would listen about how the new system would be better for business. Hans Bachmann, the craftmaster, sided more with tradition. His workers responded to the bells. They came to the workshop when the bells rang. The rhythm of the day, structured by the bells, structured his life. To change it would be to change something fundamental about how his workshop operated. Hermann Steiger said little in public, but in private he was devastated. He understood at some level that what was being questioned was not merely a system of timekeeping, but his entire life's purpose. If the bells were questioned, then his role was questioned. If his role could be done away with or fundamentally changed, then what was he? A man in his 68th year with no other skills, no other purpose, no other reason for his continued place in the community. The women of the village had their own opinions. The bells signaled the midday meal, and the midday meal was sacred, a breaking of labor when family members could gather. The mother who was working in the fields could hear the bells and know that soon she could sit with her children. The bells were a promise of reunion, a guarantee of structure. Many of the women were suspicious of Father Johann's modernizing impulses. The young people were more divided. Some saw Father Johann's changes as evidence of progress, a sign that the village might advance into the modern world. Others were simply resistant to change in general, as young people sometimes are, attached to the traditions they had grown up with. In the tavern in the evenings, the argument grew heated. Old Gunther Hoffmann, who had worked in the fields for 60 years, declared that any attempt to change the bells would be an attempt to destroy the village itself. "The bells are God's voice," he said, his speech slurred from wine. "To silence them is to silence God." To which a younger man, Peter Neuhoff, responded that God's voice did not depend on bronze and rope, and that perhaps they had been worshipping the bells instead of God for so long that they could no longer tell the difference. These arguments were reported back to Father Johann, who began to feel that he was facing not just reasonable people with different opinions, but a kind of stubborn resistance to progress itself. He became more convinced that he was right, that his vision for the village's spiritual and intellectual advancement was correct, and that the attachment to the bells represented exactly the kind of blind adherence to tradition that kept communities trapped in the past. The second pastoral council meeting was tense from its beginning. Father Johann laid out his proposal more formally this time. He had, he said, been thinking deeply about the spiritual needs of the community. He believed that the bells, while traditional, represented a kind of spiritual laziness. Instead of bells that summoned people, why not a system where people would be expected to come to voluntary prayer services? This would strengthen their faith, because it would be a choice rather than a response to an external stimulus. He proposed a radical change. The bells would ring only 3 times per day: at dawn, to mark the beginning of the day; at noon, to mark the holy hour of midday; at 6 o'clock in the evening, to mark the day's end. No more rings for work, no more rings for sleeping. Just 3, morning, noon, and evening, and even these might be reduced to a single bell rather than the traditional 3. Furthermore, he said, the early morning ring would be delayed to 7 o'clock after he had completed his new mandatory dawn devotion service. All parishioners, he insisted, should be expected to attend. Jakob Metzler tried to soften the proposal. "Father, this would be a significant change to how our community operates. People have grown accustomed to the bells. They depend on them." "They depend too much," Father Johann said, his tone sharp. "They have become passive. They wait for bells to tell them when to work, when to sleep, when to pray. A modern community should be more active, more engaged, more self-directed." "But we are not a modern community," Hans Bachmann said. "We are a village, we are not a city. The bells have worked here for centuries." "Which does not mean they are ideal," Father Johann countered. "It only means they are familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for rightness." The argument went in circles. Hermann Steiger sat through most of it in silence, his weathered face unreadable. Near the end of the meeting, he finally spoke. "Father," he said, his voice steady, "I have rung these bells for 43 years. My father rung them before me, my grandfather before him. We have not been careless with this duty. We have not treated it as something trivial. The bells are serious to us, they are sacred. They mark the human journey from birth to death, from sleep to waking, from labor to rest. They are the voice of God's creation, the sound that reminds us we are alive and part of a community. To diminish them is to diminish ourselves. Father Johann listened respectfully, and when Hermann finished, the priest responded with genuine kindness in his voice. "I understand why this matters to you, Hermann, but I must ask, is this truly about the community's spiritual well-being? Or is it about preserving a role that gives your life meaning? I ask not to wound you, but because I believe it's important we ask ourselves difficult questions." This was perhaps the cruelest thing Father Johann could have said, because it was partially true. Hermann's identity was bound up with the bells, and yet, to suggest that this was the only reason to preserve them was to reduce something complex to something simple, something spiritual to something purely personal. The vote was called. Jakob Metzler, as mayor, would cast the deciding vote along with the other council members. Franz Kaufmann voted in favor of Father Johann's proposal. Hans Bachmann voted against it. Jakob Metzler, after a long pause, voted in favor. Father Johann had won. The bells would be changed. Hermann Steiger learned of the decision before the official announcement. Someone from the council told him, perhaps with the intention of giving him time to prepare himself, perhaps from a mixture of pity and respect for what was about to be taken from him. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he walked through the village in the darkness. He walked past the homes where he knew people were sleeping, past the fields where he had worked as a young man, past the river where he had waded as a child. He walked past every place that the bells had marked, every moment in the village's life that had been structured by the sound he had made with his own hands. At 3 in the morning, he climbed to the bell tower for the last time before the change would be implemented. The village was utterly silent in those dark hours. No sound at all except the wind in the tower and his own breathing and the creaking of the old wooden steps beneath his feet. He reached the top and stood in the darkness, running his hands over the ropes he had held every single day for 4 decades. At 5 o'clock, when the village was just beginning to wake, Hermann rang the bells as he always did. First Martin, the deep boom, then Catherine with her clear tone, then the small bell, Kressendorf, bright as a bird's call. He rang them for 3 minutes, the traditional time, but he rang them with something in that sound, some quality that made people rise from their beds and pause before beginning their work. Something was different, they would later say. The bells sounded different that morning. They sounded the way bells sound when they are saying goodbye. After the morning rings, instead of descending as he normally did, Hermann remained in the tower. He sat on the floor with his back against the wooden post that supported the bell frame, and he wept. He wept for the ending of something, for the loss of a life structure that had sustained him for 4 decades. He wept for the passage of time, for the way the world changed whether you wanted it to or not, for the way progress often meant the destruction of things that had been good and functional and beautiful in their own way. The change was implemented on a Monday, in August 1846. Father Johann had decreed that there would be no morning bell until after the devotion service ended. This meant that for the first time in the village's long history, the dawn came without the bells. The sun rose, the light spread across the fields, birds sang, but the bells did not ring. For most of the villagers, this was simply the first day of a new arrangement. They woke naturally or by the habits of their own bodies, and they proceeded to get ready for the day. Some of them attended Father Johann's devotion service, about 20 people, mostly older women and a few men who wanted to show their loyalty to the new priest. Others did not attend, and without the bell to summon them, many simply continued with the work of preparing breakfast, getting children ready, moving through their morning routines at their own pace. At 7 o'clock the bells finally rang. But now it was only the small bell, Kressendorf, ringing 5 times, not the full celebration of all 3 bells, but a single, smaller sound. The message was, "It is now 7 o'clock. Please consider going to work if you have not already done so." The effect was immediate and noticeable. The village seemed to become less coordinated. Without the powerful double signal of the morning rings, people drifted into their days more gradually. Some workers arrived at their work an hour later than they used to. The baker, used to beginning his work at 5:30 in order to have bread ready by 7, found himself rushing or arrived at work later than his custom. The noon ring was now just Catherine alone, ringing 12 times. The evening ring was Martin alone, ringing 6 times. The final bell for sleep had been eliminated entirely. Father Johann believed it was unnecessary and perhaps even unhealthful to have the church trying to dictate people's sleeping hours. For a few days, things simply seemed disordered. And then slowly, a new routine began to form. People adapted, as people do. They learned to wake at their customary times out of habit, rather than out of response to the bells. They gathered for meals when it seemed convenient. They went to sleep when they were tired, rather than when they were signaled to do so. But something essential had been lost, though it was not immediately obvious what that something was. What had been lost was a kind of equality. When the bells rang for everyone, everyone stopped. The nobleman and the peasant, the merchant and the laborer, the young and the old, all heard the same signal. All were synchronized. In that synchronization was a kind of democracy, a kind of community that transcended individual status or preference. Now, without the bells, people began to develop individual rhythms. Some worked earlier, some later. Some ate lunch when others were still laboring. The shared experience of the day, marked by the bells, began to fragment. Father Johann saw this as progress. He saw people developing independent schedules, making their own choices about their time. He did not see, or perhaps he did see but did not believe it was important, the loss of community that accompanied this individualization. 1 week after the change, Father Johann made a surprising announcement. He had been thinking more deeply, he said, about his spiritual obligations to the community. He had realized that even the 3 daily bells might be representing too much of a compromise with tradition. He therefore wanted to propose something further. The bells should ring only on Sundays to mark the holy day. During the week there should be silence. People would be expected to manage their own time, to develop a relationship with work that was not dependent on external summons, to cultivate what he called a modern consciousness about their labor and their lives. This proposal shocked even those who had been sympathetic to Father Johann's initial changes. Sunday-only bells felt like the bells were being eliminated, even if technically they still existed. The bells as a daily part of life would be gone. The rhythm that had structured existence would be replaced by silence. The mayor called for another council meeting, but Father Johann had learned something about how institutions work. He had already announced the change from the pulpit. He had already convinced the bishop, through letters, that this was the right direction for the parish. When the council met, Father Johann was able to point out that he had the authority to make changes to worship practices, and this was a worship practice, and therefore it was his decision to make. Jakob Metzler tried to argue for compromise. Perhaps the bells could ring during the week, but only in a limited fashion. Perhaps the morning bell could be restored, just to help people coordinate the beginning of their workday. Father Johann was not interested in compromise. He believed, and he may even have been correct in believing, that any compromise would be unstable. That if he allowed the morning bells to return, then gradually people would expect the other bells to return, and before long the entire traditional system would be back in place. The only way to fully move forward, he believed, was to make a clear break with the past. The bells have ruled this community for centuries, he said. It is time for the community to rule itself. It is time for the people of this village to be free from the constant direction of external authority, even the authority of a sound. Hermann Steiger said nothing. He had largely stopped speaking after the initial changes had been implemented. He attended the council meetings, but sat in the back, listening but not participating. But everyone could see that he was aging rapidly. His face had become more lined. His shoulders, which had always been straight from decades of pulling the bell ropes, began to curve forward. He moved more slowly through the village, his steps losing some of their certainty. The first Sunday after the new arrangement was officially implemented was marked by a certain solemnity. Father Johann rang all 3 bells himself, not delegating the task to Hermann, and he rang them at the time of the Sunday service, 9 o'clock in the morning. The sound of all 3 bells together, after weeks of only single bells, was startling to the community. It seemed to wake something in people, some memory of what the bells had meant before. People emerged from their homes and moved toward the church with a kind of automatic response, drawn by a sound that had always meant something. Father Johann took this as a sign that his changes were working. "You see," he said to Jakob Metzler after the service, They gather for the bells on Sunday because they understand it is a special day, not because they are responding to an external command, but because they are choosing to gather for a sacred purpose. What he did not notice, or chose not to notice, was that some people wept when the bells rang that Sunday. Old Gunther Hoffmann stood outside his home with tears streaming down his face, not saying anything, just listening to a sound he thought might never ring in its full glory again. For the first time in 372 years, the week that followed that Sunday was entirely silent of church bells. The silence was absolute. No calls to work, no signal for meals, no marking of time with sound. The village went about its business, and yet something was fundamentally changed. The baker, who had relied on the 5 o'clock bell to wake him, overslept one morning. His bread was not ready when customers came looking for it. He fell back on using an old pocket watch to tell time, a watch his father had given him, but he was not accustomed to reading it in the dark, and he made mistakes. The school children, who had always gathered when they heard the work bells, did not all arrive at the same time. The teacher found herself with some children showing up at 7, others at 8, others at 8:30. She could not teach in this scattered way, and she sent word to Father Johann complaining. The workers in the fields had no collective signal to tell them when the day's labor should end. Some continued working until they were exhausted. Others stopped early and went home. The coordination that had previously been automatic had to be negotiated individually between masters and workers, creating small conflicts and misunderstandings, and the silence itself, the silence was a presence. It was as though something had died, and the absence of sound was a kind of mourning. On Thursday of that first silent week, Hermann Steiger suffered a stroke. He was found in his home by the miller's wife, who had come to bring him some bread. He was lying on the floor in his bedroom, half of his face paralyzed, unable to speak. The village doctor was summoned, and he determined that Hermann had suffered an attack of apoplexy, as they called it then. The word spread quickly through the village. Hermann had been taken by a stroke, and though no one said it explicitly, everyone understood the connection. The bells had stopped, and Hermann, who was the bells, had also stopped. He lived for another week lying in his bed, unable to speak or move. His daughter came from the city and sat with him. The village seemed to pause during that week. It was as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Hermann Steiger died on Sunday morning, just hours before the weekly bell ringing was scheduled to begin. Father Johann rang all 3 bells at the time of Hermann's funeral service. He rang them to mark the death of an old man who had served the community. But the timing was terrible if you believed in such things. To many in the village, it seemed as though the bells only rang for Hermann's death, not for his life. As though his entire existence could only be acknowledged now that it was over. The funeral was the largest gathering the village had seen in years. People came who had not been to church in decades. They came to pay respects to Hermann, who had been a kind of living connection to the past, to continuity, to the village's long history. Father Johann gave a sermon about the nature of progress and change. He spoke about how attachment to the past could prevent us from embracing the future. He spoke about how Hermann had been a good man, who had done his duty, but that duty had been tied to a system that no longer served the community's needs. The message, intended or not, was that Hermann had been replaced by something better, that the silence was preferable to the sound, that what he had given his entire life to was no longer needed. After Hermann's death, the question of who would ring the bells on Sundays became urgent. Father Johann could not ring them himself every week. He had other responsibilities. The bell ringer position had been vacant for a week, and now Hermann was dead. The village waited to see what Father Johann would do. Many assumed he would simply install a new bell ringer, but Father Johann, it turned out, was not planning to. He was planning to ring the bells himself, once per week on Sunday morning. And for the rest of the week there would be silence. It was announced at Hermann's funeral, as though it were an honor to him. The bell ringer position, which had existed for centuries, was being eliminated. The role was complete. The age of regular daily bells was over. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2 years. The village adapted to the new way. New workers came to replace old ones. Children who had been born in silence, who had never known the daily bells, did not miss them because they had nothing to compare them to. The routines changed and new routines formed. People learned to tell time by looking at the sky, or by consulting watches, or by simple habit. Father Johann's reforms continued. He established a school where children were taught to read in German rather than Latin. He encouraged people to think for themselves rather than simply accepting what they were told. He organized discussions about new ideas, about science, about the possibility of progress and improvement in many areas of life. And yet, there was a persistent, unspoken grief in the community. It was not something you could point to or measure. It was more a kind of hollowness, a sense that something important had been lost. The farmers noticed it first. They found that the coordination of labor was more difficult. When everyone had worked to the rhythm of the bells, there had been an almost unconscious synchronization. Work crews had formed naturally around the signals, and everyone had understood when the day's labor should begin and end. Now, without the bells, there was more negotiation, more conflict, more frustration. The women of the village noticed that the midday meal had lost something of its sacredness. When the bells rang at noon, there had been a sense of community as everyone paused at the same moment. Now some people ate at noon, others at 1 o'clock or 12:30, and there was no single moment when the village gathered. The older people noticed that the evenings were darker. When the final bell had rung at 9 o'clock, there had been a sense of the day ending, of closure, of rest beginning. Now the evening just faded away into darkness without any marker, and sleep came without any sense of transition. But these were not things anyone spoke about openly. Father Johann had won the argument, and it would have been ungracious to openly mourn what had been willingly given up. 2 years into the silence, the first real problems began to appear. Franz Kaufmann, the wealthy merchant who had supported Father Johann's reforms, discovered that his business was actually less efficient without the coordinated rhythms of the bells. His trade depended on reliable timing. When merchants from neighboring villages arrived to conduct business, they could no longer synchronize their meetings with a shared signal. Kaufmann had to rely on written agreements about timing, which sometimes failed. He found himself losing business to competitors in villages that still maintained regular bells. More troublingly, his workers were less productive. Without the external structure of the bells, some workers took longer meal breaks. Others simply did not show up for work at the agreed-upon times. The flexibility that Father Johann had celebrated as freedom turned out in practice to look much like chaos. Kaufmann began to regret his initial support of the priest's reforms. He spoke to Jakob Metzler about this and found that the mayor had similar regrets. The administrative work of managing a community turned out to be much easier when there was a simple system to fall back on. When everyone knew that work began at the bell, there were no ambiguities. Now there were constant negotiations, constant misunderstandings, constant small conflicts over what time things should happen. The teachers in the school found that, without the bells to structure the day, children's attention was harder to maintain. The school had always begun when the morning work bell rang. Children understood this as an automatic signal. Now the school began whenever Father Johann decided it should begin, and the timing was less consistent. Children arrived straggled and late. Parents did not know precisely when to send them. Most significantly, the Saturday market, held each week in the village square, began to deteriorate. The market had always been structured by the bells. Vendors would arrive and set up when they heard the morning work bell. Customers would come at predictable times. Now, without the bells, the market was chaotic. Vendors and customers had to negotiate individually about when to arrive. Frequently, vendors set up at different times, or customers came and found the market not yet open. The bustle and social energy that had characterized the market began to diminish. People began to talk about this quietly, in homes and in taverns. The talk was not loud, not public, but it was persistent. There was a sense of regret beginning to crystallize, a sense that perhaps something important had been lost. Father Johann, however, remained convinced that he had been right. When people complained to him about the difficulties they were experiencing, he interpreted these complaints as evidence of people's continued attachment to habit. He believed that what they were experiencing was the pain of transition, the growing pains that accompanied any genuine reform. He believed that if they just persisted, eventually they would adapt to the new way and would appreciate the freedom it offered. He began giving sermons about the importance of embracing change. about not retreating into the comfortable past, about the necessity of discomfort as a prerequisite for growth. These sermons were well-reasoned and eloquently delivered, and they also had the effect of making anyone who disagreed with his vision of the village's future feel morally suspect, as though their nostalgia for the bells was a failure of faith or a failure of nerve. In the autumn of the second year of silence, a man arrived in the village. His name was Dietrich Hoffmann, and he came from Zurich, sent by the regional church authority to evaluate how Father Johann's reforms were progressing. Hoffmann was a kind man, and he was also an observant man. He spent a week in the village, attending services, talking to people, observing how the community operated. He watched the disorganization of the market. He noticed the mill owner complaining about workers arriving at inconsistent times. He saw the school struggling with children who arrived late and scattered throughout the morning. He also noticed something less tangible but more important. He noticed that the village seemed less happy than it should be. There was no obvious suffering, no poverty, no obvious problems, and yet there was a kind of weariness, a lack of vitality, a sense that something essential was missing. On the evening before Hoffmann's departure, he asked to meet with Father Johann alone. "Your reforms are impressive," Hoffmann said, "and they are well-intentioned. But I want to ask you something. What has been the actual effect on the community?" Father Johann was defensive. He talked about the school he had established, the reading that people had learned, the way people were now thinking for themselves rather than simply accepting authority. He talked about progress and the necessity of change. Hoffmann listened respectfully, and then asked a different question. "Do you believe that your goal is to make this village into a model of modern efficiency? Or is your goal to make the people of this community happier, more fulfilled, more connected to each other and to God?" "Both," Father Johann said. "They should be the same thing, perhaps," Hoffmann said. "But I have been observing this village, and I have a concern. I believe that you have successfully introduced elements of modernity and progress, but I also observe that something has been lost. The community is less coordinated, less connected. People seem lonelier." Father Johann objected strongly to this characterization. He had not made people lonely. He had freed them from the tyranny of external control. If anything, the loneliness that Hoffmann was detecting was the necessary pain of that freedom, the disorientation that comes when habits are broken. "Perhaps," Hoffmann said carefully, "there is a difference between freedom and isolation. Yes, people are no longer controlled by the bells, but they are also no longer synchronized with each other. And humans are social creatures. They need to feel connected to something larger than themselves. They can gather in the church," Father Johann said. "They can choose to gather for spiritual purposes. But they are not gathering," Hoffmann said quietly. "Attendance at Sunday services has declined over the past 2 years. People are not choosing spiritual communion. They are becoming more isolated into their individual routines." This was true, and Father Johann knew it was true, and he did not have a good response to it. Hoffmann left the next day, and before he left, he told Father Johann something that would haunt the priest for the rest of his life. "You sought to reform a system that, whatever its limitations, was working. You have replaced it with nothing, and now the community is suffering from the void." After Hoffmann's departure, something shifted in the village's collective consciousness. It was as though permission had been granted, through Hoffmann's criticism of Father Johann, to speak openly about the regret that many people had been feeling. Jakob Metzler called another council meeting. This time the conversation was different. There was no question of whether the bells should return. Instead, the question was how to convince Father Johann to allow them to return. "He is stubborn," Hans Bachmann said. "He will not change his mind because one visitor from the city told him he was wrong. But he must see that things are not working," Franz Kaufmann said. And his support for this position was significant because Kaufmann had been one of Father Johann's earliest supporters. They decided to approach the priest not with arguments about tradition, but with arguments about practical efficiency. They presented him with careful documentation of the problems the village was experiencing: the disorganization of the market, the inconsistency in school attendance, the difficulty in coordinating labor. Father Johann listened to all of this and said something that surprised them all. "You may be right." He did not say this as a surrender. Rather, he said it as a scholar might say it, as someone considering a hypothesis that might have merit. "It is possible," he continued, "that I have been too zealous in my reforms. Perhaps there is value in some compromise, in maintaining some of the external structures, while still preserving the elements of individual freedom and modern thinking." The council members exchanged glances. This was not the response they had expected. "I propose this," Father Johann said. "The bells will return, but not as they were. I will institute a modified system. The bells will ring in the morning to signal the beginning of the day, and in the evening to signal its end. They will ring at noon to mark the midday hour. But they will ring using only the small bell, Kressendorf, the bright one, not the deep authority of Martin. And there will be no other rings beyond these three. This way, we maintain some of the community structure that I now recognize has value, but we avoid the absolute submission to external authority that concerned me." This was not exactly what the council had hoped for. They would have preferred the full restoration of the traditional bell schedule, but it was more than they had expected to get. They accepted Father Johann's compromise. Now, of course, there arose the question of who would ring the bells. Hermann Steiger had been dead for 2 years. His daughter still lived in the village, having chosen to stay after her father's death rather than return to the city. Her name was Anna, and she was a woman of 50 years old, childless, educated, and deeply connected to her father's legacy. When the council approached her about taking on the role of bell ringer, her response was immediate. "I cannot do it. I know nothing of ringing bells. I am a woman." But the council, and more significantly Father Johann, were now in a different mindset. Father Johann, having been convinced that some degree of tradition was valuable, was also now more open to reconsidering other rigid structures. Why, he asked, should women not be bell ringers? The work was not so physically demanding that a woman could not do it. The role was as much about responsibility and precision as it was about strength. Anna protested further, but Father Johann would not accept her refusal. "Your father gave his life to this duty," he said to her. "It would be fitting for his daughter to continue that service to the community." Reluctantly, Anna agreed. She climbed the 147 steps to the bell tower and learned to grasp the ropes. They felt strange in her hands, foreign and powerful. She had come up to this tower as a child and watched her father work, but she had never participated in the actual ringing. It took her several days to learn the patterns, to develop the muscle memory, to understand the rhythm that needed to be followed. The first time she rang the 3 remaining bells, only Kressendorf, Father Johann's modified version, her hands trembled. The sound seemed thin and insufficient. She wondered if this was what the community had been reduced to, if this was all that remained of the old glory. But gradually, over days and weeks, her trembling stopped. She learned to ring with confidence. She learned the subtle variations in timing that made the bells sound right. She learned to feel the weight of the rope, to anticipate the moment when it would pull her up and when it would come back down. And the community, hearing the bells again, experienced a kind of relief. Not complete relief. They wanted the full traditional schedule back, but significant relief nonetheless. The morning ring of Kressendorf meant the day was beginning. The noon ring meant it was time to pause for food. The evening ring meant the day's labor was ending. The basic structure had been restored, and life became easier to navigate. But there was something wrong with Anna ringing the bells. Though no one said this explicitly for a long time, the male bell ringers before her, Hermann, his father, his grandfather, had all been men whose entire lives were devoted to this work. It had not been their sole responsibility, but it had been their primary identity. Hermann had not married. His father had married very late in life and had only one child. His grandfather had been a widower for 30 years and had never remarried. The role of bell ringer seemed to require a kind of solitary devotion, a separation from the ordinary entanglements of domestic life. Anna, by contrast, was a woman who had other relationships and other responsibilities. She had friends in the village. She had family obligations. She had interests that extended beyond the bell tower. She was not, in other words, someone who had organized her entire existence around the role. This meant that she occasionally could not ring the bells. When she was ill, she had to ask someone else to do it. When she had family obligations, she sometimes arrived late. She did not ring the bells with the kind of religious devotion that Hermann had brought to the task. More significantly, there was something about seeing a woman in the bell tower that subtly changed how people understood the role. The bells had always been the voice of authority, the marker of the structure that organized community life. With a man ringing them, this could be understood as the voice of patriarchal order, the masculine principle of organization and law. With a woman ringing them, the meaning became more ambiguous. Some people found this liberating. It seemed to suggest that authority did not have to be masculine, that women could participate in the community's organization. Others found it unsettling, as though something sacred had been profaned. Father Johann noticed this discomfort and began to worry that his solution had created a new problem. He wondered if he should have insisted that a man take on the role. There were younger men in the village who could have learned to ring the bells. But it felt too late now to suggest replacing Anna. He had invited her to take on the role specifically because she was Hermann's daughter, because it seemed to honor the continuity of the family tradition. What he had not anticipated was that restoring the bells would only highlight how much else had changed in the village. The bells were no longer rung by a man who had devoted his entire life to them. The bells no longer regulated the entire day, only 3 moments of it. The bells were now a compromise, a half measure, a shadow of what they had been. And yet, despite all of this, despite the incompleteness of the restoration, the community found itself transformed by the return of even this diminished version of the bells. It was as though the sound itself carried memory, and hearing it again awakened something in people that had been sleeping during the years of silence. About 6 months after Anna began ringing the bells, something began to shift in the village's collective mood. It was not dramatic, it was subtle, but it was real. Children who had been born during the years of silence, who had never heard the bells before Anna began ringing, developed an attachment to the sound. They associated it with the rhythm of their lives, with the beginning and ending of things, with safety and predictability. When they heard the bells, they felt oriented in time. When they did not hear them, on rare occasions when Anna was unable to ring, they felt lost. The adults experienced something similar. The part of their minds that had mourned the bells during the years of silence found itself somewhat comforted by their return, even though it was only 3 rings instead of 7, only Kressendorf instead of the full trinity of bells. The market began to recover its vitality. Vendors knew when to arrive. Customers knew when to come. The social energy that had characterized the market began to return. People started looking forward to the market day again, not just as an economic exchange, but as a social event. More significantly, the Sunday services began to be better attended. With the sound of the bells marking the beginning and end of the week's days, Sunday seemed to have recovered some of its specialness. The rhythm of the week was organized around the bells, and Sunday was the day when that rhythm was most fully acknowledged and honored in the church. Father Johann began to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong about more than just the bells. Perhaps he thought the entire modernizing impulse had been based on a misunderstanding. Perhaps progress did not require the elimination of tradition, but rather a thoughtful integration of tradition and innovation. He began to speak about this in his sermons. He talked about how the old ways were not necessarily obstacles to progress, but rather the foundation on which progress could be built. He spoke about the importance of understanding why things had been done a certain way before attempting to change them. He talked about respecting the wisdom embedded in tradition, even as we also embrace new knowledge and new ways of thinking. Jakob Metzler, hearing these sermons, felt vindicated. This was what he had tried to suggest to Father Johann years earlier, that change should be careful and gradual, that community traditions served important purposes, that what had been should not be discarded simply because it was old. By the 5th year after the bell's return, a new equilibrium had been established in the village. It was not the old equilibrium that could never be fully restored, because time had moved forward and people had changed. But it was a functioning integration of the old and the new. Father Johann's school continued to operate. Children learned to read and to think critically, but they also continued to attend church services with their families, and they also continued to listen to the bells and to structure their days around them. The old and the new coexisted, each enriching the other in ways that neither would have alone. The village economy had stabilized. The market flourished. Trade relationships with neighboring villages were solid. The coordination problems that had plagued the early years of silence had been resolved through the restoration of the bells. Anna had become an accepted fixture in the bell tower. There were still some people who felt uncomfortable with the idea of a woman as bell ringer, but these were mostly very old people whose discomfort seemed to be fading with time. Younger people had never known anything different and therefore accepted it as natural. She developed her own relationship with the bells. She did not have the devotional intensity that Hermann had brought to the role, but she had her own kind of care and attention. She learned to listen to the bells as she rang them, to respond to how they sounded, to make adjustments in her ringing based on the weather and the temperature and the seasons. She developed a kind of musical relationship with the bells that was different from Hermann's, but equally valid. Father Johann continued to serve as the village's priest, but with a humility that had not been evident in his earlier years. He still believed in the value of education and modern thinking, but he no longer saw these things as standing in opposition to tradition. He began to read the old records of the church, trying to understand the history of the village and the reasons why things had been organized the way they had been. In doing this research, he discovered that the bell system had not simply emerged randomly. It had been carefully designed by the village's founders, based on their understanding of human nature and community needs. The structure they had created was not perfect, but it was the product of genuine wisdom about how to help people live together, how to create a shared rhythm that would bind a community together. This knowledge changed something in Father Johann. He began to see the bells not as a relic of an unenlightened past, but as an early attempt at what we might call systems design, a key way of organizing collective time and action for the community's benefit. 10 years after the bell's return, on an autumn afternoon when the light was turning golden and the year was drawing toward its end, Father Johann climbed the stairs to the bell tower for a conversation with Anna. She was up there doing some maintenance work on the bell ropes, checking them for wear, making sure everything was secure for another year of ringing. Anna, Father Johann said, when he reached the top, I have been thinking about something for a long time, and I wanted to talk to you about it. Anna set down the rope she had been examining. She was 60 years old now, still strong, still capable, but showing signs of the age she carried. Her hair was more gray than brown. I have been thinking, Father Johann continued, about your father, and about the years of silence, and I have come to believe that I made a serious mistake. Anna waited. She had heard something like this implied before, but she had never heard Father Johann say it so directly. I believed, Father Johann said, that the bells represented a kind of tyranny, that they imposed external control on the community in a way that was spiritually harmful. But I was wrong about this. The bells were not tyranny. They were a kind of gift. They gave people something that humans need. They gave them shared time, shared rhythm, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves. He paused, and Anna could see that this confession was difficult for him, that it cost him something to admit his error. When I removed the bells, Father Johann continued, I thought I was liberating people, but what I actually did was isolate them. I gave them individual freedom, but I took away their sense of community, and I did not understand at the time how valuable that sense of community was. You have restored the bells, Anna said quietly. That is something. I have restored them partially, Father Johann said, but I've always wondered if I should do more. If I should restore them fully to the way they were when your father rang them. Return all the rings, all 7 signals throughout the day. Anna thought about this. She had heard stories from the older people in the village about the full bell system. She had never experienced it herself, but she had seen the power of even the 3 remaining rings. She could imagine what 7 would mean. That would be a big change, she said. It would, Father Johann agreed. And I would understand if you did not want to do it. Ringing 3 times per day is one thing. Ringing 7 times per day is quite another. It would be more physically demanding. It would occupy more of your time. Anna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, when my father was sick before the stroke, I used to wonder what it would be like to do what he did, to be the voice of the village, to mark time for everyone, to be part of something that stretched back so far into the past and would presumably continue far into the future. I wonder that less now. I am too old to be enthusiastic about such things, but I still wonder sometimes. If you wanted to restore the full schedule, I would do it. Father Johann looked relieved. You would? Yes, Anna said. I think my father would have wanted that. And I think it would be good for the village. The announcement of the restoration of the full bell schedule came at Sunday service. Father Johann stood in the pulpit and spoke about his journey of understanding, about how he had learned through experience that some things that seemed backward were actually forward-looking in their own way. I'm not abandoning, he said carefully, my belief in education, in critical thinking, in the value of progress and improvement. But I have learned that progress does not require the destruction of tradition. Rather, progress requires the integration of tradition with innovation. We can have both. We can have a community that thinks critically, and also a community that honors its past. We can have individual freedom and also shared rhythm. He explained that starting the following Monday, the bells would ring according to the full traditional schedule. 5 o'clock in the morning for the beginning of the day, 6 o'clock for the signal to go to work, noon for the midday pause, 6 o'clock in the evening for the end of work, 9 o'clock at night for sleep. Anna Steiger, he said, addressing her directly where she sat in the congregation, has agreed to ring these bells. Her father, Hermann Steiger, devoted his entire life to this sacred duty. Through Anna's continued service, we honor his memory. But also, through this return to the full bell schedule, we honor the wisdom of all those who came before us, who built this community and structured it in ways that have proven, over generations, to support human flourishing. The reaction in the congregation was mixed. Some people were delighted. The older people, especially those who remembered the full bell schedule from their childhoods, were moved almost to tears. They had not realized how much they missed that complete structure until they heard that it would be restored. Others were skeptical. Some worried that Anna would not be able to handle the increased physical demand. Some felt that Father Johann was reversing himself too completely, that he should have stuck to his guns about modernity and progress. But by the following Monday, when the bells rang out at 5 o'clock in the full traditional way, Martin's deep boom, Catherine's clear tone, and Kressendorf's bright ring all together, even the skeptics found themselves responding to the sound. The restoration of the full bell schedule transformed the village in ways both subtle and profound. The most obvious change was practical. With clear signals throughout the day, work became better coordinated. The baker knew exactly when to begin work. The school began at a predictable time. The market opened with certainty. Business became more efficient, which would have pleased the younger Father Johann, who had believed progress was primarily about efficiency. But there was something more than efficiency being restored. There was something that had no practical value, but had profound meaning. The recovery of a shared temporal space, a sense that everyone in the village was, at certain moments, experiencing the same thing at the same time. At 5 o'clock in the morning, when the bells rang to wake the village, there was something sacred about the shared experience of waking. At noon, when the bells rang and everyone in the fields or the workshops stopped to eat and rest, there was something almost like prayer in that shared pause. At 9 o'clock in the evening, when the bells rang and people could feel themselves settling into sleep, there was a sense of closure and peace. The bells had another effect that was not anticipated. They became a way of marking individual lives within the context of community life. When a woman was in labor, the bells would ring in a particular pattern, 3 slow peals, and everyone in the village would know that a new life was being brought into being. When that child was born, the bells would ring a number of times equal to the child's age if it was a child who did not survive to adulthood, or a longer pattern if it was a child who would live. Everyone heard the bells and understood that new life had come to the village. When someone died, the bells would ring in the death pattern, slow, solemn peals, and everyone would know loss had come. The number of peals would tell the age of the deceased, so the village would know whether this was a death of someone young, taken too soon, or someone old who had lived a full life. The bells gave the death ritual, gave it dignity, gave it community witness. In between birth and death, the bells marked all the moments. They marked beginnings and endings. They marked daily rhythms and sacred occasions. They were, in essence, the voice of time itself, and time is the substance in which human lives are lived. Anna served as bell ringer for 23 years after the full schedule was restored. She aged during this time as people do, but she also found in the role her father had held a kind of purpose that sustained her. She never married. She never had children of her own. But in a certain sense, the entire village became her family. Every person in it heard her voice, the bells, at multiple points throughout every single day. She was woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that few people are. She developed a reputation for the particular way she rang the bells. Older people said that her touch was different from her father's, less forceful perhaps, but more musical. Younger people who had known no other bell ringer thought her style was simply the way bells should sound. Travelers from other villages sometimes remarked that the bells in this village had a distinctive character, a particular sweetness and clarity that they did not hear elsewhere. Anna developed an intuitive understanding of the bells. She learned to adjust her ringing based on weather conditions, pulling harder in cold weather, when the bells seemed reluctant, more gently in summer, when the heat made the metal respond too enthusiastically. She learned to ring them slightly differently on feast days, to inflect the sound with a kind of joy. She learned to ring them with particular solemnity, when someone in the village had died, as though she was mourning along with everyone else. She also learned to hear what people who heard the bells were experiencing. She could often tell by how people responded to the sound what was happening in their lives. When someone was grieving, they would sometimes emerge from their home just to stand and listen to the bells, as though the sound was a kind of comfort. When there was joy, after a good harvest, after a child was born, the bells seemed to enhance that joy, to mark it, to make it real. One afternoon, when Anna was 83 years old and had been ringing the bells for more than 40 years, Father Johann came to visit her in the bell tower. Father Johann was now 70 years old and in declining health. This would turn out to be one of the last conversations they would have. "Anna," Father Johann said, "I want to tell you something that I have come to believe in all these years that we have worked together in this restored way." Anna was sitting on an old wooden bench, resting after the noon rings. She gestured to Father Johann to sit beside her. "I want to tell you," Father Johann continued, "that I was wrong about many things, but I was especially wrong in my fundamental understanding of what progress means." "What do you mean?" Anna asked. "I believed that progress meant constant change, the rejection of the old in favor of the new," Father Johann said. "But I now believe that true progress is something much more subtle. It is not about changing everything, but about changing what needs to be changed while preserving what is valuable. It is about honoring the past while also embracing the future." He paused, and Anna could see that he was struggling with emotion. "The bells," he said, "are still the same bells that have been ringing for 400 years. The mechanism is ancient. The sounds are the same sounds that Hermann's ancestors heard. And yet, and this is what amazes me, these ancient bells are not obstacles to progress. They are the foundation. They are what makes progress possible, because they give people stability and a sense of continuity even as the world changes around them." "My father understood this," Anna said quietly. "Your father did," Father Johann agreed, "and I did not at first. But I have spent the last 20 years learning what your father knew instinctively, that some things should not change, that some continuities are more important than innovation, that a human community needs both roots and wings, both tradition and progress." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the afternoon sounds, the wind in the tower, the creaking of the wooden beams, the distant sounds of the village going about its business below them. "I wonder," Father Johann said finally, "what history will make of those years when the bells were silent? Will people remember them as a necessary trial, a crucible through which the village had to pass? Or will they remember them as a kind of madness, a period when the community lost its way?" "Both, perhaps," Anna said. "I think history is never simple. People will interpret those years according to their own beliefs about what matters. But I think most people will simply be grateful that the bells came back." When Anna was 90 years old, she began to think seriously about what would happen to the bells after she could no longer ring them. She had lived longer than her father had. Hermann had died at 91, and she knew that the end of her life was approaching. She spoke to Father Johann about this. By this time, Father Johann was quite old and his health was failing. He was in his 80s and seemed to be diminishing day by day. "What will happen to the bells?" Anna asked him directly. "When I can no longer ring them?" Father Johann looked troubled by this question. "I do not know," he admitted. "Your father's successor was less than ideal until I realized the solution was to ask you. But I do not know what we should do now. There is no obvious heir this time. Your father had a daughter. You do not." "There are others in the village," Anna said. "Younger people who might take on the role." "Perhaps," Father Johann said, "but the role has become something specific. It requires not just the physical ability to ring bells, but a particular relationship to the community, a particular understanding of what the bells mean. I do not know if we can teach that to someone new." This conversation troubled them both, because they understood that the succession of the bell ringer was not just a practical question. It was connected to something fundamental about the community's continuity, about whether the village could maintain its sense of self across generations. Father Johann died 2 weeks later. He was 84 years old and had served as the village's priest for 48 years. His last sermons had been about legacy and responsibility, about how each generation inherits from the past and has a duty to pass on what is valuable to the future. Anna lived for 3 more years after Father Johann's death. She continued to ring the bells faithfully, but she also began to systematically teach younger villagers about the role. She taught a young man named Michael, who was 25 years old and whose father was the blacksmith. Michael had grown up hearing the bells and loved them. He had always been fascinated by the bell tower and had sometimes climbed up to watch Anna ring. Anna taught Michael the patterns. She taught him how to adjust his ringing based on weather and season. She taught him the history of the bells, the reasons why they rang at the times they did, what each different pattern meant. Most importantly, she tried to teach him the spiritual meaning of the bells, the way they represented the community's consciousness, the voice of shared time and shared experience. Michael was a good student. He was young enough that his hands were strong and his attention was focused. He learned quickly. But Anna knew and Michael knew that he was not Hermann and not Anna. The bells would ring differently when he took over. They would still be the same ancient bells, but they would carry a different voice. Anna died on a winter evening in 1901. She was 93 years old. She had rung the bells for more than 60 years. She had marked countless births and deaths, countless workdays and feast days, countless moments of human life structured by sound. When she died, the bells were rung in the death pattern, slow, solemn peals, and the village grieved. They grieved for Anna herself, but they also grieved for an era ending. With Anna's death, a direct continuity was broken. Her father had rung the bells. She had rung the bells. But now it would be Michael, a member of a different generation entirely, someone who did not carry the same history in his body and memory that Hermann and Anna had carried. The bells continued to ring after Anna's death. Michael rang them faithfully, and when Michael grew old, another younger person took over, and then another. The succession continued across the generations, the role of bell ringer passing from one person to another. The bells never falling silent again after they were restored, but something had changed, something that could not be recovered, even though the bells themselves never stopped ringing. The relationship between the bells and the community was no longer quite the same. The bells were now rung out of custom, rather than out of a deep spiritual understanding of their meaning. Fewer people listened to the bells with the kind of conscious attention that older generations had brought to them. The 20th century came to the village slowly. Modern life, with all its transformations, arrived later to small communities than it did to cities. But it did arrive. First came the trains. A railway line was laid down about 5 kilometers from the village, and suddenly the village was connected to the larger world in a way it had never been before. People could travel to the cities. Goods could be transported. The isolation that had defined the village for centuries began to diminish. With the trains came telegraphs and then telephones. Suddenly people could communicate across distances instantaneously. The bells, which had been the primary means of communication, the way information was broadcast to everyone in the community, became less essential. If you needed to know the time, you could check a telephone. If you needed to know about an important event, someone could telephone you. Then came electricity, and with it electric clocks on buildings and in homes. Watches became common. The need for a communal system of timekeeping diminished radically. Young people began to wonder why the bells still rang at all. What purpose did they serve when everyone carried a watch? When the First World War came, it came to the village like a terrible interruption. Young men were conscripted. Some of them did not return. Michael, the bell ringer who had succeeded Anna, was too old for military service, but his son was taken. For 4 years, while the war raged across Europe, the bells rang in the village, but the sound seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality of what was happening beyond the valley. The village sent 12 young men to the war. 5 of them returned. 7 were killed, and their names were recorded on a monument erected in the village square. When the names were read aloud during the dedication ceremony, the bells rang in mourning, and for a moment it seemed as though the bells had recovered some of their old power, their old ability to mark human suffering and give it dignity. But after the ceremony, life returned to normal. The bells continued to ring on their schedule. But the world had changed in ways that could not be easily repaired. The village had lost an entire generation of young men. The work of maintaining the community, the businesses, the farms, all of this now had to be done by fewer hands. The economic depression of the 1930s struck the village like a blight. The market that had flourished for centuries found itself without customers. The farms that had supported generations became unprofitable. Young people began to leave, moving to cities, seeking work in factories and businesses. The village, which had been sustained by continuity, by generations of people living in the same place and doing the same work their ancestors had done, began to fragment. People were no longer connected to the land, to the community, to the bells. During this period, the role of bell ringer became something of an embarrassment. Young people saw the bell tower as a remnant of a past that was dead. Why was the community still maintaining this ancient system of timekeeping when electricity and machines had made it obsolete? The bell ringer at this time was a man named Johann Steiner, not related to Hermann Steiger or Anna, but a man who had inherited the role from his father. Johann was a quiet man, unpretentious, and he was deeply troubled by the feeling that his work had become pointless. He continued to ring the bells faithfully. He climbed the 147 steps every morning at 5 o'clock and rang them. But he did it with a sense of futility, a sense that he was participating in something that no one truly valued anymore. The bells rang during the Depression years, marking time for a community that seemed to be slowly disappearing. Then came the Second World War, and with it, a new kind of horror. The village was occupied by military forces. Soldiers came and established a command post in the church. The bells were requisitioned. The metal was needed for weapons, it was decided. The ancient bronze bells, which had rung for nearly 500 years, were removed from the tower and prepared to be melted down. Johann Steiner, the bell ringer, tried to intervene. He spoke to the military commander, explaining the historical significance of the bells, their importance to the community. The commander listened with a kind of contempt. Bells, he explained, were less important than weapons. Everything was resources to be used in service of the war. The night before the bells were to be removed, Johann climbed to the bell tower one final time. He rang all 3 bells together, Martin, Catherine, and Kressendorf, in a sound that was wild and mournful. It was not a scheduled ringing. It was not part of the traditional pattern. It was simply a man saying goodbye to something he loved. The village heard the bells that night and understood what was happening. Many people emerged from their homes and stood outside, listening. It was an impromptu wake for the bells themselves, a community mourning before the loss had fully occurred. The next morning, soldiers arrived with equipment and removed the bells. The tower stood empty and silent. The rhythm that had organized the village's existence for centuries was broken. For 5 years, the bells were gone, and the tower was silent. The village experienced this silence differently than it had experienced the earlier silence, when Father Johann had removed the bells in the name of progress. This silence was not a choice. It was an imposition, a theft, a violation. It felt like the community itself had been wounded. People adapted, as they always do. Without the bells, the community continued to function. Work began and ended at appointed times, organized by individual initiative rather than collective signal. But something was missing, something that the passage of 5 years could not fill. Johann Steiner, the bell ringer, was no longer needed. His role had been eliminated along with the bells. He found work elsewhere, and his identity as bell ringer, the thing that had sustained him through the Depression years, was gone. Near the end of the Second World War, when it became clear that the military occupation would eventually end, there came a revelation. The bells had not been melted down, instead they had been hidden. A local official who still had some sympathy for the community had secretly buried them in a forest outside the village, preserving them from destruction. The bells that had survived nearly 500 years had survived this war as well. When the war ended and the occupation forces withdrew, the bells were dug up and restored to the tower. The restoration was not done immediately. There was much damage to repair, much work to be done to restore the church and the community after years of occupation. But eventually the bells were cleaned and rehung in the tower. It took several months to find someone willing to take on the role of bell ringer again. The old rhythms had been broken. Young people had discovered that they could organize their lives without the bells. There was no obvious successor to Johann Steiner, but there was an old man in the village named Heinrich, who had been a bell ringer's assistant in his youth before the bells were removed. He was now in his 70s, but he still remembered the patterns. He had kept the knowledge alive in his mind during all the years of silence. Heinrich took on the role and began ringing the bells again. His hands were old and did not move as smoothly as they once had. His hearing was diminished, so that he could not always judge the quality of the sound he was producing. But the bells rang again. The pattern was restored. The village began to recover its rhythm, but the bells that rang after the war were not quite the same bells that had rung before it. For one thing, the context had changed irreversibly. The village, which had been relatively isolated for centuries, was now connected to the world by roads and cars, and eventually by television and radio. Young people who came of age after the war did not have the same relationship to the bells that their grandparents had had. The bells were no longer essential to their survival or to their sense of belonging to the community. More fundamentally, the experience of the war had changed how the community understood time itself. The bells had traditionally represented a kind of eternal recurrence, the rhythm of day following day, season following season, year following year, all of it organized according to a pattern that was assumed to be permanent. But the war had shattered the assumption of permanence. The community had experienced rupture, interruption, violence. The bells could no longer represent an assumption of continuity that the war had proven false, and yet people continued to listen to the bells. Heinrich rang them faithfully for 20 years after the war. When he died, another person took on the role. The bells continued to ring. What had changed was not whether the bells rang, but what they meant to the people who heard them. They had shifted from being seen as essential to being seen as nostalgic. They were valued not because the community could not function without them, but because they represented a connection to the past, a reminder of continuity in a world that seemed to be changing faster and faster. By the 1970s, the village had been transformed into something quite different from what it had been. There were cars now, and a main road that connected the village to larger towns. Young people regularly commuted to larger cities for work. Television had come to every home. The isolation that had defined the village for centuries was gone. Fewer and fewer people listened to the bells with any kind of serious attention. They were simply part of the background, the sound of the village, something that marked the hour but did not particularly regulate behavior. When you needed to know the time, you looked at a clock or checked your phone. When you needed to wake up, you set an alarm. The bells were decorative almost, a nostalgic reminder of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. The role of bell ringer had become something of a burden. It was viewed as a necessary but unrewarding job, something that someone had to do, but that few people aspired to do. The waiting lists of the past, families eager to take on the role, seeing it as an honor, had disappeared. Now the village struggled to find anyone willing to take on the responsibility. By the 1980s, there was serious discussion about replacing the human bell ringer with a mechanical system. The bells could be rung automatically, many people argued, by a mechanism that would eliminate the need for human labor. It would be more reliable, more precise, more efficient. Why persist with the old way when the new way was clearly superior? A plan was developed. A mechanical system was designed that would ring the bells at the precise times. The old bell ringer, who had served for nearly 30 years, was offered a small pension and respectfully retired. The mechanical system was installed, and it worked beautifully. The bells rang at exactly the right times with perfect consistency. There was no variation in the sound, No adaptation to weather or season, no hint of human intention or care. Just the pure mechanical repetition of the schedule. Within a few months of the mechanical system being installed, something that no one had anticipated began to happen. People began to complain. The bells did not sound right, they said. The sound was harsh, mechanical, divorced from anything human or natural. More importantly and more subtly, the relationship between the community and the bells changed. When a human had been ringing the bells, there was a sense that the bells were being rung for the community, that someone had chosen to mark the day with sound. With the mechanical system, the bells simply rang indifferently for no one in particular. The sense of care, of intention, of community connection, all of this had been lost. The old bell ringer, a man named Martin, who had served faithfully for 30 years, became something of a local figure of regret. People who had been casual about the bells when he was ringing them now lamented his absence. They began to speak of the humanity that his ringing had brought to the bells. Martin himself was devastated by the change. The bells had been his primary identity for 30 years. When that role was taken away, he lost a fundamental part of how he understood himself. He fell into a kind of depression, became an alcoholic, and died within 5 years of being retired. Some said literally of a broken heart. There were attempts to restore Martin to the role, but he refused. He felt that his time had ended, that the community had decided that he was no longer needed. The mechanical system remained in place. As the years progressed into the 1990s and 2000s, the transformation of the village accelerated. People increasingly lived their lives not according to the bells, but according to the devices they carried. Their phones, their digital watches, their personal schedules. The bells became increasingly irrelevant. Children were born who barely noticed the bells, who could not have told you what time they were ringing. The tourist industry discovered the village. Travelers came to see the authentic medieval church, to photograph the charming bell tower, to experience a kind of romanticized past. The bells became part of the scenery, part of the experience of tourism, rather than part of the functioning community. There was a kind of cruel irony in this. The bells had been driven out of the community's daily consciousness by modernity and efficiency. But they had not disappeared entirely. Instead, they had been preserved as a museum piece, a relic, something to be looked at rather than listened to, something that carried weight only as a historical artifact. The mechanical system continued to ring the bells faithfully. No one heard them specifically anymore. They were simply part of the sound of the village, as unremarkable as wind or traffic. For something that had once been sacred, this invisibility felt like a profound loss. In the early 2000s, the village council began to discuss what to do about the bell tower. The mechanical system was aging and would need to be replaced soon. The question was, should they replace it with a newer mechanical system, or should they do something else? Some people argued for simply removing the bells and letting that chapter of the community's history close. Others argued for restoring a human bell ringer, a way of returning some humanity and intentionality to the bells. The debate revealed something important about the village's relationship to its own past. There was a kind of nostalgia for the bells, but it was nostalgia without genuine understanding. People remembered that the bells had been important, but they could not quite remember why. The meaning had been lost even as the bells themselves persisted. A young woman named Sarah, who had moved to the village only a few years earlier, became fascinated by this question. She began researching the history of the bells, reading old records, interviewing elderly people who remembered the days when the bells had truly structured the community's life. What she discovered moved her deeply. She learned about Hermann Steiger and his 43 years of devotion. She learned about Anna and her 60 years of service. She learned about the years of silence and the power of the bells' restoration. She learned about the role the bells had played in holding the community together during times of war and depression and uncertainty. Sarah began to advocate passionately for restoring a human bell ringer. She gave presentations to the town council. She wrote articles for the local newspaper. She argued that something essential had been lost when the mechanical system replaced the human being, and that it was not too late to recover it. Through Sarah's advocacy, and through a growing cultural movement toward valuing human connection over mechanical efficiency, The village council finally decided to restore a human bell ringer. It was not a decision made easily. The mechanical system was efficient. It did not require a salary or benefits or vacation time. But there was a recognition that efficiency was not the only value that mattered, that there was something important about maintaining a human presence, a human intention, a human connection to the community's rituals. Sarah herself volunteered to take on the role. She was in her early 30s, educated from outside the community, and yet she had developed a genuine passion for the bells and for understanding what they meant. The council accepted her offer. Learning to ring the bells was challenging for Sarah. The ropes were heavy and resistant. The patterns were complex and had to be learned through practice and repetition. But she approached the task with a kind of reverent attention, understanding that she was not just ringing bells, but participating in a tradition that stretched back hundreds of years. The first time Sarah rang the full schedule of bells, the 5 o'clock morning ring, the 6 o'clock work bell, the noon pause, the 6 o'clock evening bell, and the 9 o'clock sleep bell, people in the village noticed something had changed. The mechanical system had rung the bells more loudly and harshly, with a kind of demanding quality. Sarah's ringing was softer, more musical, more responsive to the quality of the sound. Her hands adjusted the intensity and pace of the ringing. She listened to what the bells were producing and responded to it. The bells sounded alive again, as though they were being rung with conscious intention and care. Over the following months and years, something remarkable began to happen. People started to listen to the bells again. Not everyone, certainly. Many people in the village remained largely indifferent to them. But enough people began to pay attention that the bells began to recover some of their lost significance. The experience of the pandemic, which came in 2020, reinforced this recovery. When the village was locked down, when people's lives were disrupted and uncertain, the bells became something to hold on to. The regular ringing at 5 o'clock, at 6, at noon, at evening, at night became a kind of reassurance. The bells marked the fact that time was still passing, that the day still had structure, that life was continuing, even though so much had changed. People who had barely noticed the bells before began to listen to them during the pandemic. They found comfort in the regularity of the sound. They found that pausing at noon when the bells rang gave them a moment to stop and breathe. They found that the bells ringing in the morning helped them feel that the day was beginning, that there was still order in the world. Even as so much was uncertain and frightening, Sarah, during this period, took on an importance to the community that she had not expected. She was no longer simply a woman ringing bells. She was, in a sense, a keeper of continuity, a person maintaining one of the few constants in a time of radical uncertainty. By the 2020s, the bells had acquired a new kind of meaning, different from what they had meant in the past, but no less significant. For the centuries when the village was isolated and pre-industrial, the bells had been essential to survival and functioning. They were not optional. The community could not operate without them. That was their power and their necessity. For 100 years or more they had been obsolete, preserved only out of habit and tradition. They had meaning only because people chose to give them meaning, valued them only because they represented continuity with the past. Now, in the digital age, when every person carried devices that could tell them the time with perfect precision, the bells had acquired yet another meaning. They represented something that machines could not provide: a human connection, a sense of care and intention, a reminder that not everything in life should be optimized and automated. The bells were no longer essential, but they had become valuable. They were a way of saying that some things mattered simply because they connected us to the past, connected us to each other, connected us to something larger than our individual lives and concerns. Sarah developed a kind of philosophy about the bells. She began to speak about them in interviews and presentations as a way of thinking about technology and modernity, about what was lost and what could be recovered when we insisted on maintaining human connection alongside mechanical efficiency. The bells, she would say, are a way of keeping time that is fundamentally social. When you hear the bells, you know that everyone else in the village is hearing them too. You are not just tracking time individually. You are experiencing time as a community. That sounds old-fashioned, but I think it is exactly what we need now, in a world where we are more connected by technology, but also more isolated. The bells remind us that we belong to something larger than ourselves. 75 years after the bells were first removed during the Second World War, they had been restored to their full traditional schedule. 50 years after they had been replaced by a mechanical system, a human hand had returned to ring them. The cycle had come around again. The bell tower that had stood for nearly 600 years remained standing. The bells that had been cast 500 years ago still hung in their frame. The patterns that had been established in the 15th century were still being rung. But the meaning had transformed, had shifted, had become something new while remaining fundamentally the same. The village was no longer isolated. Young people still left for cities and careers. Tourism had changed the character of the place. Technology had integrated deeply into every aspect of life, and yet the bells rang, and people heard them, and in hearing them, they were connected to something that stretched backward through centuries and forward into a future that was uncertain but shared. On an autumn afternoon, with golden light turning the stone buildings amber, Sarah stood in the bell tower after ringing the noon bells. She was alone in the tower, as she always was after ringing. She used these moments to reflect, to think about the bells, to consider what they meant and what they had come to mean. She thought about Hermann Steiger, who had rung these same bells 43 years and had devoted his entire life to the role. She thought about Anna, Hermann's daughter, who had rung the bells for 63 years and had found in them a kind of purpose that sustained her through a long life. She thought about the years of silence, when the bells had been removed first by Father Johann's reforms and then by the war. She thought about how the silence had taught the community that the bells were not optional, that something important had been lost when the sound stopped. She thought about Martin, the bell ringer who had served faithfully for 30 years and had fallen into despair when his role was taken away by a mechanical system. His story had taught her something essential, that the role of bell ringer was not just about making a sound, but about being a part of the community's consciousness, about being entrusted with a sacred duty. She thought about the mechanical system that had replaced the human bell ringer, about how efficiency and automation had removed the element of human care and intention. And she thought about how the community, living with that mechanical precision for years, had begun to realize what had been lost. Sarah understood something that not everyone in the village understood. The bells were not really about time. There were 1,000 other ways to tell time in the modern world, 1,000 ways to coordinate activity and organize the day. The bells persisted because humans needed something more than mere coordination. They needed connection. They needed to know that others in their community were experiencing the same moment at the same time. They needed to feel that they were part of something larger than themselves. The sound of the bells, Sarah had learned, was not neutral. It was not simply a mechanical production of vibrating metal and moving air. It was communication. It was a message that said, "You are part of a community. You are not alone. Time is passing for all of us together." Each time she rang the bells, she tried to put intention into the sound. She tried to ring with consciousness of what the day meant, what season it was, what had happened in the community, what the people who would hear the bells might be experiencing. On days when she had learned that someone in the village had died, she rang with solemnity. On days when there was a reason for celebration, she tried to inflect the sound with joy. On ordinary days, she rang with a kind of steady confidence that said, "Yes, the day continues, we are still here, time is still moving." She knew that many people did not consciously notice these variations. But she also knew that they felt them at some level. The bells sounded different on different days, and that difference communicated something important. As Sarah moved into her 40s and began to think about what would happen after she could no longer ring the bells, she faced the same question that had haunted the village many times before. What comes next? She began, as Hermann had before her and Anna had after him, to teach someone to ring the bells. A young man from the village who had grown up listening to Sarah's ringing expressed interest in learning. Sarah began to pass on the knowledge, the patterns, the philosophy of the bells. But she also understood that the bell ringing could not simply continue unchanged into a future that would be radically different from the past. The mechanical system had taught the village a lesson about what happened when you tried to replace human presence with pure efficiency. But there were limits to what a human bell ringer could do. Eventually, Sarah would grow old, and her successor would grow old, and at some point, the community would face the question again. Should the bells continue to ring? And if so, how? She hoped, as she climbed the 147 steps to ring the afternoon bells, that the community would find a way to preserve something essential about the bells: the human intention, the conscious communication, the sense of community connection, even as it adapted the practice to meet new challenges and new possibilities. The bells in the village tower continue to ring today. As they have for nearly 600 years, they have been silent for periods. They have been removed and hidden and restored. They have been rung by hand and by machine. They have been meaningful and mundane. They have connected the village in moments of crisis and have seemed almost irrelevant in moments of peace and prosperity. And yet they ring. The patterns that were established in the 15th century are still being rung, with variations and adaptations for a modern world. The same bronze bells that called villagers to prayer centuries ago still mark the time for a community that now has 1,000 ways to tell time, but chooses to listen to the bells anyway. The question of why the bells persist is not a simple one. It is not because they are necessary. They clearly are not necessary in any practical sense. It is because something in the human heart responds to the sound of bells, to the knowledge that others are hearing the same sound at the same time, to the sense of connection across time to generations who came before and will come after. The bells are a way of saying, we are still here. We are still together. Time is still passing, and we are marking it not alone but as a community. In a world that grows more complex and more isolating with each passing year, in a world where technology connects us while also isolating us, in a world where efficiency has become a primary value, even when it comes at the cost of connection, the bells represent something else: the value of gathering, of community, of shared time and shared experience. The sound echoes across the valley in the morning when people wake. It echoes at noon when people pause for food and rest. It echoes in the evening when the work ends. And at night it echoes one final time, marking the day's end and calling people to sleep. Someone is ringing those bells. Someone chose to wake up at 5 in the morning and climb the tower and pull the ropes. That choice, that intention, that devotion is the real meaning of the bells. In a world where so much is becoming automated and divorced from human intention, the bells remain stubbornly, defiantly human. And that is why they ring. This has been the story of a village and its bells. A story of how something can be lost and found again, transformed but essentially continuous. A story of how meaning can shift and change while remaining vital. A story of how communities maintain connection across centuries, not through force or necessity, but through conscious choice and persistent devotion. The bells ring still, calling across the centuries to all who have heard them, all who will hear them, reminding us that we are not alone, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that time is a shared experience and not merely an individual passing.